Today we're going to keep learning about Judas Maccabeus. And the handout mostly is from First Maccabees still. And the books are called Maccabees, is after Judas Maccabeus, but also the whole family sometimes is called the Maccabees family. More technically, properly, they're called the Hasmonean family, and that's what we're usually going to call them. But remember, the name Maccabees means the hammer, and Judas received this name because of the ferocity with which he fought, the strength with which he crushed the enemies of Israel. He had a series of victories over smaller armies at first, but progressively larger and larger armies. There was a significant part of the Israelite population that went out to him, that joined his movement. The more successful he became, the more powerful he became. And he quickly grew from a small leader of a rebel band to a commander of an actual army, and really got the attention of the nations around him. And after what we looked at last week, we saw him win that series of victories, eventually against the Seleucid army itself, at least a part of it, that Lysias had charge of. But he didn't stop there. After he purified the temple, after he took Jerusalem, he started going on the offensive. He started going against some of the other nations around them, where there was a Jewish population, which was typically oppressed, typically in trouble of some kind, and he would go and he would be their rescuer, and he would subdue the other nations that had always been Israel's enemies, the Idumeans, which are the Edomites. From now on, when we talk about the Idumeans or Idumea, we're talking about the area and the people where the Edomites lived, the descendants of Esau. And after the Jews went out into exile, when the Babylonians took them away, the Edomites moved in to some of Israel's historic territory, and we're going to learn more about them later. But Judas defeated them. He defeated the Philistines. He went out the other way across the Jordan River, had huge success wherever he went, and started being more of an aggressor, more proactive when it came to building his army, increasing the power of Israel at this time. So let's start with our handout here. Just the first couple paragraphs. You remember King Antiochus Epiphanes, when he heard what Judas was doing, wanted to go right away and crush him, but didn't have the military stability, the political stability he wanted. There were other areas of his kingdom that were in revolt, that were not paying their taxes, so he couldn't pay mercenaries. So he sent Lysias to deal with the Jews, and he went on a campaign into Persia. King Antiochus was going through the upper provinces when he heard that Elemius in Persia was a city famed for its wealth in silver and gold. Its temple was very rich, containing golden shields, breastplates, and weapons left there by Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian king who first reigned over the Greeks. So he came and tried to take the city and plunder it. It's kind of a recurring thing when the Seleucid kings need money going after temples. They were a place where a lot of wealth got accumulated. Sometimes they were even used as banks by people because they were secure places. They were sacred places that normally wouldn't get attacked and plundered, except by a very strong king, which, and more than one king underestimated the religious fervor with which these temples were defended. Remember Antiochus III died in this way, trying to plunder a Persian temple. So Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, came and tried to take the city and plunder it, but he could not, because his plan became known to the men of the city, and they withstood him in battle. So he fled, and in great grief departed from there to return to Babylon. Then, when he's already depressed and angry and feeling like a failure because of this, someone came to him in Persia and reported that the armies that had gone into the land of Judah had been routed, that Lysias had gone first with a strong force, but was turned back before the Jews, and that the Jews had grown strong from the arms, supplies, and abundant spoils that they had taken from the armies they had cut down, that they had torn down the abomination that he had erected upon the altar in Jerusalem, and probably either some kind of pagan altar or an idol that was there. They had torn it down, and that they had surrounded the sanctuary with high walls as before, and also Beth Zur, his city. Now, when the king heard this news, he was astounded and badly shaken. He took to his bed and became sick from grief, because things had not turned out for him as he had planned. He lay there for many days, because deep grief continually gripped him, and he concluded that he was dying. So he called all his friends and said to them, "Sleep departs from my eyes, and I am downhearted with worry. I said to myself, to what distress I have come, and into what a great flood I am now plunged. For I was kind and beloved in my power." And in general, that was true. He was a very generous king, which is one of the things that led him into financial trouble. "But now I remember," he says, "the evil I did in Jerusalem. I seized all her vessels of silver and gold, and I sent to destroy the inhabitants of Judah without good reason. I know that it is because of this that these evils have come upon me. And behold, I am perishing of deep grief in a strange land." And remember also that this is the Jewish history of what happened that we're hearing here. Whether he actually said this exactly is something people debate. But this is the kind of sober, realistic, historical sounding description of what happens. First Maccabees is more of a straight up history, and it's a little bit more restrained, almost a little more secular than Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees is a very religious book, always trying to make a point about how it's God behind the scenes doing all of this stuff, which is very true. But sometimes it goes a little bit overboard in trying to make that point. This is what Second Maccabees says about the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, and there may be some truth in this account as well. Is it probably exaggerated? Almost certainly, but it says, transported with rage when he heard this news that Lysias had been defeated, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to flight. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he had completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with him. For in his arrogance he said, "When I get there, I will make Jerusalem a cemetery of Jews." But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he had ceased speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures, and that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange inflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews, and giving orders to hasten the journey. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he who had just been thinking in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea, and imagining that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away, and because of his stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. And because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of heaven. So, yeah, this is the description it gives. And of course, he recognizes and repents and says, "This is all because of what I did to Israel." But yeah, we can surmise, putting this stuff together, he was very angry and probably would have come back and avenged himself on the Jewish people if he had not experienced this illness. Whether it was quite that bad that nobody could come to him and be with him because of how badly he stank, that's probably not true. He did speak to his people. He left them instructions as to how he wanted things taken care of in the kingdom after he was gone. We'll get to that a little bit. Before we do, let's go one more time to Daniel chapter 11. We've been going there quite a bit. And this may be the last time we do. And yeah, we're not going to read that entire portion that I have there. But just backing up a little bit to what we've read before, this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. It says, "Mighty forces from him will stand," in verse 31, "profane the sanctuary fortress, and abolish the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in intrigue. And some of those who have insight will fall, in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the time of the end, because it is still to come at the appointed time." So we have references in there to the persecution, to the death of some of those who have insight. We're going to see just today the beginning of the Maccabees dying off. But also, it's hinted here there will be political deception. People who are insincere will join them, pretend to be their friends, and some of them will fall as a result of that. And that's more what we're going to be talking about the week after next week, probably. But there is a transition here. I'm not actually going to go ahead and read to you what we just talked about, the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, because it's not in here. Actually, there is a death description later on, but it doesn't match his. And the big transition here happens in verse 36. Verse 35 says, in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the time of the end, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And he will succeed until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. And here we start talking about primarily another king. And there are some things here that could relate to Antiochus as well. And there are some things earlier, like the abomination of desolation. That's something Jesus said the Antichrist will do as well. But primarily, before this point, is talking about Antiochus. After this point, it just doesn't match him anymore. Not exactly, anyway. This says that he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for any god. He will magnify himself above them all. Antiochus Epiphanes, I mean, the name that he took means God manifest, yes, but he didn't reject the worship of the gods of his fathers. He set up altars to Zeus. He tried to enforce the worship of the Greek gods. So this goes beyond what he did. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Great honor to those who recognize him. At that time, in verse 40, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. All of this description right here, he gets into another war with Egypt. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall, in verse 41. But these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. For some reason, they will be spared. Then he will send forth his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. But he will rule over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the desirable things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But reports from the east and the north will dismay him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he will pitch the tents of his holy pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. So he's going to come back and camp in Israel between the Mediterranean Sea and Jerusalem, in that area somewhere. And yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So that is not where Antiochus Epiphanes died. That is not how he died. Those are not the events surrounding his death. And there is a liberal explanation of this. If you don't believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that it's genuine prophecy, or even, honestly, some people who believe that it is the Word of God, but that this is not written as prophecy, that it wasn't meant to be taken as prophecy. They will say that up until this point, the writer of Daniel, at least this portion of Daniel, who is not actually Daniel, wrote the history that he knew. And they would say that this portion was written during the time we're talking about right now, during the time of the Maccabees. and that what happened from this point on, from that transition on, is what the author hoped would happen, what he predicted happening, how the story was going to end. And in justice to the people who say that, there is a genre of Jewish writing that is pseudepigraphical. Okay. Remember this big book, it has the deuterocanonical books, the books we think of as apocryphal in it. But it also has a whole section called the pseudepigrapha. And a pseudonym is a false name. A pseudepigraphal book is one that is attributed to someone who didn't actually write it. For instance, some of the books here, we have the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Isaac, the Testament of Jacob, the Ladder of Jacob, the Testament of Job, the Testament of Moses, Testament of Solomon, Ascension of Isaiah, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Baruch, the Revelation of Abraham, the Revelation of Elijah, the Revelation of Zephaniah, the Apocryphon of Ezekiel. Now, these books, for the most part, were not, everybody knew that they weren't written by those people. And they weren't intended to deceive people. Think of it this way. The best illustration I can give is if I were to write a book today about George Washington kneeling at Valley Forge, praying to God, and in the middle of his prayer, an angel appeared to him and said, George Washington, I am going to show you the future of this country. And he leads him through it and gives commentary on what God is doing throughout all of these stages in history. And then we get up to the point where we are now, and it kind of leaves with a what's going to happen next question. And anybody reading that book today would know that I'm just writing an interesting political book, a political and religious book about my views of the current situation and the history of America. But if somebody a few thousand years from now found it, they might assume that it was supposed to be written by George Washington himself, if they didn't know any better. And that's kind of the awkward position we're in with some of these books. What we have to rely on, and they weren't doing this in order to deceive people, they were doing this to honor those people that they were writing about. That's what a lot of people assume that Daniel is. And a lot of later books imitate the style of Daniel. But remembering what we've said before, Daniel was seen by the Jews as being written by an actual prophet. They weren't confused about these other books, but they believed that Daniel had actually written Daniel. They took it as prophecy. They have the story, remember, of Alexander the Great coming to Jerusalem and being shown the book of Daniel and his place in it. The Jews believed that it was written back then and that it was genuine. And they had very high standards for evaluating what came from a prophet and what did not. So based on the place it has in Jewish history and in the Jewish view, the traditional view, that it is actually a prophecy written by Daniel himself, there's no reason to doubt that unless you say that prophecy itself can't happen in the way that Daniel wrote it. And remember, Jesus himself quoted or referred to this portion of Daniel as prophecy. So if we believe him, then we should also believe Daniel. So this part of the prophecy after this transition focuses on future things. It draws parallels between that and Antiochus. There are similarities there, but it doesn't really fit into the history that we're learning right now. Right. Right. Yeah, the end of Daniel chapter 11 does seem to be talking about the Antichrist in a very direct way. What's going to happen with him? And he will meet his end in Israel during the Battle of Armageddon. That's where his army is going to be when he falls. So, the next guy in line who took over the Seleucid kingdom was Antiochus V, Eupator. And the second column of the first page there on your handout. Then he, Antiochus Epiphanes, called for Philip, one of his friends, and made him ruler over all his kingdom temporarily. He made him the regent. He gave him the crown and his robe and the signet, that he might guide Antiochus his son and bring him up to be king. Thus King Antiochus died there in the 149th year. And when Lysias learned that the king was dead, he set up Antiochus the king's son to reign. Lysias had brought him up as a boy, and he named him Eupator. So the last thing Antiochus Epiphanes does in this history is make a bit of a mess, a political mess, honestly, with his dying instructions. First of all, remember that Antiochus Epiphanes himself was never meant to be king. The real king was his brother. And his brother had a son. And Antiochus came back as that son was taking his place as a hostage in Rome. So Antiochus became king as the king's brother, not as the king's son. So the next one in line after Antiochus is not Antiochus's son. It is his brother Seleucid's son. So that's one problem with this. Antiochus is making his own son king, taking the line away from his brother and giving it to himself. That's going to cause division. That's going to cause a problem. The other thing that causes a problem that we see here is that he names Philip regent when Lysias was the regent that he had left in charge before. Lysias is the one who raised his son and was already in charge, and Lysias was not going to give up his power to Philip. So we have multiple ways in which this was a problematic bit of instruction that Antiochus left. And really, he did the Jews an amazing favor with this instruction. He divided his kingdom. He made it weak in a way that allowed the Jews, that allowed Judas Maccabeus and his followers to succeed in a way they would not have otherwise. And we're going to see that. So let's go down to the next paragraph there. Now the men in the citadel kept hemming Israel in around the sanctuary. So remember when the city of David, the citadel, the part of Jerusalem that was fortified, the outer part wasn't really as it used to be, but the inner part that was still in control. It was still controlled by the faction of the kingdom that was not friendly toward Judas and his followers, the Hellenistic party, along with some Seleucid soldiers who were there protecting them. That was kind of one of their last refuges. And even though Judas had taken the city, even though they had purified the temple, there was still this group in the city that was fortified, that wasn't giving up. And they were trying in every way to harm the Jewish rebels, and strengthen the Gentiles. So Judas decided to destroy them and assembled all the people to besiege them in that citadel in Jerusalem. They gathered together and besieged the citadel in the 150th year, and he built siege towers and other engines of war. But some of the garrison escaped from the siege, and some of the ungodly, that is, Hellenistic Israelites, joined them. And they went to the king, the new king, Antiochus V, and said, "How long will you fail to do justice and to avenge our brothers? We were happy to serve your father, to live by what he said and to follow his commands. For this reason, the sons of our people besieged the citadel and became hostile to us. Moreover, they have put to death as many as they have caught, and they have seized our inheritances. And not against us alone have they stretched out their hands, but also against all the lands on their borders," which is true. "And behold, today they have encamped against the citadel in Jerusalem to take it. They have fortified both the sanctuary and Beth-zur, and unless you quickly prevent it, they will do still greater things, and you will not be able to stop them." One of these people in the citadel who was under attack here and who sent this distress call to Antiochus V was Menelaus, the official high priest who had been installed before. Remember, the one who had bribed Antiochus IV for the position. So he's still alive, he's still on the scene, and he's still a point of contention between the Hebrews and the Hellenists. The king was enraged when he heard this news. So he assembled all his friends, the commanders of his forces, and those over the cavalry. And mercenary forces came to him from other kingdoms and from islands of the sea. The number of his forces was 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 horsemen, and 32 elephants accustomed to war. And a little down further it says, "Then Judas marched away from the citadel," once they had entered Israel. Judas marched away from the citadel, so he abandoned the siege. And he encamped at Beth Zechariah, opposite the camp of the king. Early in the morning, the king rose and took his army by a forced march along the road to Beth Zechariah. And his troops made ready for battle and sounded their trumpets. They showed the elephants the juice of grapes and mulberries to arouse them for battle. Not sure exactly why that works, maybe because it looks like blood. Now a part of the king's army was spread out on the high hills, and some troops were on the plain, and they advanced steadily and in good order. All who heard the noise made by their multitude, by the marching of the multitude, and the clanking of their arms, trembled, for the army was very large and strong. It was greater than anything the Maccabees had fought up to this point. But Judas and his army advanced to the battle, and 600 men of the king's army fell. But we're going to find out this was not a victory for Judas. This was their first actual defeat that they experienced. Eleazar, called Abaron, this is one of Judas's brothers, saw that one of the beasts was equipped with royal armor. It was taller than all the others, and he supposed that the king was upon it, because it was so incredible looking, so royal looking. He assumed that that is where the king, Antiochus V, was. And so He gave his life to save his people and to win for himself an everlasting name. He courageously ran into the midst of the phalanx to reach it. He killed men right and left, and they parted before him on both sides. He got under the elephant, stabbed it from beneath, and this is what you see in the picture if you look closely. There's Eleazar stabbing the elephant. And it fell to the ground upon him, and there he died. So he sacrificed his life to kill this elephant. And it turned out the king was not on it. It was just the trained Indian rider who was controlling the thing, and the people shooting arrows. And when the Jews saw the royal might and the fierce attack of the forces, they turned away in flight. And we're going to see the conclusion of this incident next week, since we're out of time today. Any questions about what we've gone over today? All right, let's go ahead and close. Father, thank you for being, again, just in so much control over everything that happens. We see all the intricate politics going on in our day, and they are exactly as politics have always been, as battles, as war has always been. And you're just as in control now as you always have been. Help us to trust in you, to trust your word. Thank you for the confidence that we can have in it. And please help us to be an example to others of courage, of devotion to you, no matter what the odds, no matter what the cost to ourselves personally. Help us to be wise in the battles we choose to fight, and to seek to honor you most of all in every situation. In Jesus' name, amen.